Welcome to the Untold Story podcast, everyone. I'm Martha McCallum, and it's great to have you back with me today. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Douglas Brinkley, who, of course, is a very well-known presidential historian, a great author, a biographer. He's a Rice University history professor, and I always enjoy talking to Douglas because putting things in historical perspective, I think, is so important in this world that we live in, where we seem to sort of have these huge historic events and then just move right on to the next thing. So Douglas, it's great to have you with me. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
I read a piece that you wrote recently for Vanity Fair, and it was about the 1968 presidential election and the Democratic Convention, which took place there. And of course, we're going to be heading back to Chicago in August, in just a few weeks, for the Democratic National Convention. And I'd love for you to kind of take everyone back there, because we have just had this huge historic event. We've had a president who has stepped down and declared that he will not run again for office. And that has really set this campaign for 2024 into a complete upheaval. And we're going to talk about that sort of later in our conversation. But put it in perspective for us, a president stepping down, a 1968 convention, and what you learned when you dug back in and looked at it again.
It's really quite a momentous time. The fact that the president of the United States sort of randomly one afternoon issues on social media the fact that he's stepping down, won't seek re-election, it put everybody, caught people half by surprise and half people saying, thank God. Biden wasn't about Joe Biden's age. It's more the fact that at least over the last year and a half, people were seeing signs of a cognitive decline. His refusal to take a test made people scratch their heads. And then I think by the time of the Super Bowl, when he would not do an ad where you could just do an infomercial, a president could talk for 15 minutes right before a Super Bowl, Biden refused to do that. And so there started becoming deep concerns in the Democratic Party, and those really just turned into a volcano on June 27th with the debate with Donald Trump, when he just got slaughtered. It was just it was almost a wreckage on television to watch it. It wasn't about one mistake or two mistakes or saying something wrong. Past debates, like when Gerald Ford famously didn't told Jimmy Carter in a debate that Poland wasn't over Soviet domination. And that was a big mistake, but it seemed like Biden had one after the other. And from that moment on, there became a louder voice that maybe he needs to step down and let Kamala Harris, his vice president, take over. He did not want to do that, Biden. He dug in deep, really deep. He almost burrowed himself into the sand of Delaware shore. I'm not leaving. I'm not going. And so the party looked for ways to get rid of him. And I think Nancy Pelosi is the key person, along with Chuck Schumer, that ended up telling him they were going to lose Congress and the Senate, all downstate ballots, everywhere. He did not get out. Biden basically said, give me a week and I'll figure something out. And then he went forward with it. Nothing quite like it in U.S. history, but the comparison that's been made is with Lyndon Johnson in 1968.
The Untold Story continues right after this.
It's interesting, just to double back for a second. I think about the interview that President Biden did with George Stephanopoulos, and George asked him, well, what if Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer come to you and say, you can't win, you got to get out? And he leaned in and said, it's not going to happen, in that whisper voice that he uses when he wants to use emphasis. But that's exactly what happened. And, maybe someday, I know as a historian you would love, and as a reporter, I would love to know, really like how ugly this got, because there were reports that he was very angry that his allies were turning on him. And it's a pretty intense story that I think we're going to learn a lot more about. What forced LBJ out back in 1968? What was going on in that world?
Well, at the end of 1967, in December, General William Westmoreland had said that there is light at the end of the tunnel in the Vietnam War. It got inferred to be from Robert McNamara, then Secretary of Defense, and others using that phrase that we were almost out of there. We pretty much were going to be lock, stock, and barrel out of Vietnam soon with the victory. Start early 1968 in late January, the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam, when North Vietnamese and Viet Cong agents were able to disrupt South Vietnam, our ally. They took over the embassy, airports, cafes. It was just an unexpected siege of our assets, and it looked like we were mired in Vietnam. Well, this was a blow to Johnson's prestige. He sulked about it. In March, Walter Cronkite of CBS News went on a 1-hour nightly television show called Vietnam: Who, What, Where, When, and Why. It was a special. And at the end of that broadcast said, maybe the best thing to do is call it a day, say that we meant well, we were soldiers of democracy, we came up short, and our soldiers are coming home. So then there became this theory, at least, that if you lost Cronkite, you lost the war. Morale was low in the Johnson White House, and Lady Bird, the first lady, got to Lyndon, who had heart attacks, hypertension, high blood pressure, chain smoking cigarettes. The list is long, and said, let's go. You did your service. You did what you could do. Let's go back to the ranch, the Texas Hill Country. And LBJ very quickly decided that he had to do that, that he would tell the country he was dropping out. He would have been the Democratic nominee and maybe could have got elected. Who knows? But he jumped out and went back to Texas. And the other reason was that because he was already having problems, Eugene McCarthy, a very liberal kind of whimsical almost senator from Minnesota, an anti-war peacenik, senator, get out of Vietnam guy. He was in the New Hampshire primary, almost beat Johnson, was like right next to him point by point. And lo and behold, Eugene McCarthy continued running, but then Robert F. Kennedy, senator of New York, got in. But then in very short order, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, assassinated, Kennedy shot, assassinated. And by the time the Democrats got their convention in Chicago, there was chaos everywhere between the anti-war movement and the hawks that wanted to continue fighting and college kids not wanting to get drafted. You had hippies, Black Panthers, socialists, students for the Democratic Society. It just became a swirl of anti-war protest, and Mayor Daley's police overreacted. They were overarmed and just had too many police and National Guard. Yet nobody was killed in Chicago by the police, by the way. They just were too aggressive with the billy clubs and tear gas, and it made all of Chicago, look like a war zone.
That sounds, we have a lot of chaos going on right now, and sometimes it's hard to see when you're in the middle of a moment. But we have, a former president who's the current Republican candidate who was shot at in an assassination attempt. And we have a president who's just stepped down. His vice president is running. We have protests in the country against our participation in our support of Israel, I should say, in the war in Gaza. How would you compare it, though? Does it feel, what you're describing in 1968 in Chicago sounds worse? It sounds more chaotic, even though we're in a pretty chaotic moment.
I think Chicago 68 was worse because the new left groups that had radicalized for various reasons, they were very aggressive and organized, and they knew how to spread out disinformation. It was a pre-iPhone era, but they had a great underground word of mouth and could make make havoc. And Daley's police, if you were going to, it was known. Mayor Daley was very angry that Martin Luther King Jr., before he was dead, the movement had riots in his city where people were killed, and it kind of scarred Daley. And he said strongly, nobody's going to riot in my Chicago. And there became a tension between these protest groups and the mayor. Now, look, anything can happen in Chicago this summer. We don't know, but it does seem to me that it would be. We know more. At least I don't know anymore. My wrap on this would have been pre-President Trump being shot in Butler, Pennsylvania. I would have thought modern Secret Service protection and trained police and trained National Guard would be much more able to protect Chicago today than 1968. But we saw quite a breakdown in Butler of Secret Service. So you can't be sure of anything right now.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think that when you look back at that period of assassinations from JFK and then almost 5 years later, Martin Luther King and RFK, when he was running for president, in that tumultuous moment when LBJ had dropped out, and as you described, Eugene McCarthy had given him a run in New Hampshire, and it looked like Kennedy was winning in California and could be gaining momentum. And then these just absolutely tragic assassinations that just gripped the country, and as the war in Vietnam was going so badly. And I think that for years after that, and then we had the Reagan attempt 43 years ago, it felt like that was not going to happen again, and that we had sort of locked things down to a point where people didn't get in. You're walking through magnetometers and to a lot of these events. But just as an aside here, the more we're learning about what happened in Butler, and the text messages from the local law enforcement sniper team saying, hey, there's a guy out here. I think you should keep an eye on him. This is 2 hours before former President Trump was shot. I just think it's going to undermine people's confidence in yet another American institution that we all, sort of were raised to think was just the best of the best, the Secret Service.
It's undermined my faith in the Secret Service, certainly. Yeah. A part of it is, they have 4,000 Secret Service employees, agents. They probably are understaffed. They probably need another, 500. Should be 4,500. But with that said, they're ignoring of messages. Their lack of coordination with local police. They're leaving a building so near where President Trump was speaking, just wide open like that. It was on a platform within range of the president. None of it to me adds up right now. I mean, I'm not being conspiratorial about it. I'm sure there's just not enough of the pieces of the puzzle put together. I've been waiting to learn more, but yes, it's just an utter breakdown.
Yeah, no, I've said the same thing. I'm not conspiratorial either, but you can see where it leaves a pretty wide gulf for people who want to jump into it to ask what was going on and why there would be this, sort of. Apparently, there was a Harris event going on and a Jill Biden event going on all at the same time, and it seems like if you're stretched that thin, then the Secret Service has to say, you know what, we don't feel like we can cover these 3 events in one day, so you guys are going to have to rework your schedules so that we can. But that didn't happen, so we'll see.
You know what? Yeah. There might need to be an adjunct group with the Secret Service that are basically citizen watchers, to get some people put around that are, security that aren't of their caliber, but should have been able to have recognized, somebody should have been placed on that building just to sit there with the gun. I mean, it's just if you look at it, it's just impossible for me to have been there and not say we have to have that building secure.
Yeah, it seems so obvious. And I know there's, more coming from the FBI investigation on all of this. And so we'll see where it goes. But it does leave people feeling unsettled as we head into the next convention and all of the campaigning that's going to be going on between now and then. And I want to look forward with you in a few minutes, but I found it really interesting. I went back and read LBJ's speech when he decided to drop out of the race, just to go back to him for a moment. And, when you read those speeches, and I also read Truman's speech. First of all, they strike me as far more eloquent than the speeches that we're getting today. And I know that you have also been a presidential speechwriter. It's I believe you have, right?
Yes, I have done a little.
Yes. So, and the way that Johnson is describing the situation in Vietnam and the goals of American involvement in Vietnam, he's talking to the American people as if they're, smart and paying attention, and that they're on the same level with understanding the depth of the complications of that involvement. And I found it made me sort of long for a more coherent discussion from President Biden about why we're helping in Ukraine and what our situation is with our relationship with Israel, our strong Middle East ally. So that was one thing that struck me when I was reading it. The other thing that really struck me when I was reading it was that Johnson, a Democrat, obviously, was bemoaning the fact that there was a $20 billion deficit. $20 billion. And I just thought, it is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. He's just, really saying we cannot do this. We've got to cut spending. Congress has to cut spending. We can't be in a situation where we have a $20 billion debt. And that, adjusted for inflation, is $171 billion. Now, everyone listening, just think about the fact that we are in a, multi-trillion-dollar deficit situation. 1.39 trillion, deficit situation, which is, a trillion is, I'm not a math person, but it's exponentially a lot more than the billions that Johnson was talking about here. And he said, on many occasions, I've pointed out that without a tax bill or decreased expenditures, next year's deficit would again be around $20 billion. I have emphasized the need to set strict priorities for our spending. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on the speech itself and speech writing for presidents, and also, a financial aside on what was going on at that point, Douglas.
Really great observations you're making. The first part, I think Johnson did it well when he stepped out. As you said, if you read it, it's a coherent statement, and it makes some sense. I mean, imagine if President Biden, after the debate, went and got a cognitive test or got a medical report and said, look, I've got a couple issues. I'm a little bit slowing down, maybe say what they are, and say, but look, I'm going to focus on, here's what's going on in the Middle East, and here's what's going on in Ukraine. I'm going to finish my term because I can, and I'm ready for it. But I'm going to really focus on the world at large right now, because these are problems that need to be solved, or said something like that. Instead, the problem I had with the Biden team was it just kept digging in, and they were name calling anybody who wanted them to get out. They were just, really behaving very politically selfishly, and then telling the American public that he was in perfect shape and nothing was going on. And, and so there's a vast difference between the way Johnson handled it and Biden handled it. And as for the deficit part of it, yeah, I mean, can you imagine we've changed so much where it's okay to have trillions of dollars, and this could easily be 2 trillion before we blink an eye, that in debt, and not even really making it a major plank to address in our nation. It tells you why we get into trouble right now when we're spending money we don't have. And much of it's just going around the world and being spent largely for noble causes. But nevertheless, we all have to be at some point fiscally conservative when we're dealing with the public's money, and we aren't that now. I'm I'll blame both parties.
Yeah, I would too, because, I thought when I was reading this from Johnson, this sounds like, sort of a Jack Kemp or Paul Ryan. I'm trying to think of people who used to talk about spending, because we don't hear it on the Republican side anymore either. So it's something kind of extraordinary to think about.
The cultural war between Democrats, Republicans have, I think, replaced that kind of good governance talk. And
Yes, that's a great point.
Hopefully we'll get back to our senses on the spending.
Yeah, I hope you're right about that. We'll leave it there. Douglas Brinkley, thank you so much. That is the Untold Story for today. I'm Martha McCallum. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.